An Airbus A320 with 99 souls on board is approaching an international airport for a second attempt to land. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" the first officer's voice cracks through the radio. The aircraft is descending through 700 feet. Both engines are dead. The plane is nothing more than a glider now. The stall warning screams in the cockpit. "Stall! Stall! Stall!" The captain, disoriented and tense, can barely process what's happening. The first officer's instrument panels, not working. The landing gear is not down. The residential buildings of Model Colony rush up to meet them, 1,300 meters short of safety. The captain yells, "Don't take flaps! Don't take flaps!" trying desperately to reduce drag. How did a routine domestic flight turn into this nightmare? Will they make it safe in their second attempt to land? Today, I'm going to tell you the bizarre story of Pakistan International Airline Flight 8303.
I am Captain Jack Mercer. What you're going to watch now is the story from the perspective of a pilot who has lived and seen a lot in 25 years of experience. Welcome aboard.
So it's May 22nd, 2020. The world is locked down, remember? COVID-19 has grounded most of the planet, and Pakistan is no exception. Lahore International Airport is eerily quiet. Just a handful of flights in the sky today. Flight 8303, a daily passenger service from Lahore to Karachi, is preparing for departure. The aircraft, a 16-year-old Airbus A320, manufactured in 2004, delivered fresh to Pakistan International Airlines. Here's something important. This plane was grounded for 2 months during the pandemic. It just started flying again a week earlier. But no worries, regular maintenance checks were being carried out. The plane is in good condition. Oh, yes, and get this. Brand new CFM56 turbofan engines were installed just a year prior to this flight. Pristine condition, my friend. Who's on board? 89 passengers and 6 cabin crew members. And in the cockpit, 2 pilots who are about to make decisions that will change this flight from routine to disaster, as you will see soon. Captain Sajed Gul, 58 years old, sits in the left seat. First Officer Usman Azam, 33 years old, sits on the right. Today, the first officer is training, and he will be the pilot flying. The captain is the pilot monitoring. Now, let me tell you about these 2 men, because their backgrounds are going to matter a lot, my friend. Captain Gould joined PIA back in 1996. 17,000 flight hours. Sounds like a long, successful career, right? Well, not exactly. When he first applied to join PIA, he failed his mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Yeah, you heard that right. The evaluation described him as bossy, dominant, overbearing, and having poor stress tolerance. Normally, a report like that, you're done. Disqualified. No airline wants a captain who can't handle stress. But Gul was determined. He wasn't going to take no for an answer. So what did he do? He went out and get second opinions. 5 of them. 3 psychiatrists from the UK, 2 from Pakistan. And guess what? They all declared him fit to be a cadet pilot. So he was allowed to begin training with the airline. From a pilot perspective, that's unusual. Very unusual.
In 2015, he was promoted to captain. But here's what's troubling, and you'll see why this matters later. In the 12 months before this flight, investigators found something crazy in his records. Numerous flights with high-speed approaches, high-altitude deviations, excessive rates of descent, GPWS warnings, and get this, no go-arounds were initiated. Multiple unstabilized approaches, and he just kept landing anyway. This captain clearly didn't care about standard operating procedures. Think about it. This is a pattern of behavior, not a one-time mistake. Do you agree? Now, sitting to his right is First Officer Usman Azam. He's 33 years old with around 2,300 hours of flying experience, most of it on the A320. Significantly less experience compared to the captain. But here's the thing, Azam had deficiencies during his career as well. In 2016, the airline actually withheld his promotion to first officer because of performance issues. After undergoing correctional training, he was finally promoted.
So what do we have here? This plane is being flown by two pilots with red flags in their histories. There's also a steep experience and age gap between them, 25 years difference. This creates what we call a significant power gradient in the cockpit. You know what I'm talking about, right? The first officer might hesitate to challenge the captain's wrong decisions. And yes, today, it's going to be a huge problem.
So, it's 1:05 p.m. local time, and Lahore ATC clears the plane for departure. The aircraft pushes back and lifts off from Lahore International Airport 10 minutes later. The A320 climbs smoothly into the clear Pakistani sky. The weather is perfect, calm, not a cloud in sight. The plane continues its climb and reaches its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Everything seems routine, you know? Just another day at work for these two pilots. Now, they're about 150 nautical miles from Karachi's Jinnah International Airport. ATC, Air Traffic Control, clears them to approach the airport via a route called Nabwashah 2A. Here's how it works. They need to fly at a heading of 205 degrees from the city of Nabwashah, then take a right turn near the city of Hyderabad. Their goal is to hit a waypoint called Makli at an altitude of 8,000 feet. 4 nautical miles after Makli is another point called Sabin. At Sabin, they'll need to do a holding pattern, basically flying in circles, to reduce altitude from 8,000 feet down to 3,000 feet. Well, first of all, the crew skips their mandatory approach briefing. You know, this is a critical procedure where both pilots discuss the approach route, altitudes, speeds, potential hazards, and what they'll do if something goes wrong. It's not optional. It's mandatory. Period.
The first officer enables the Nawabshah two-way approach on the flight computer, but since the crew is busy talking about things completely unrelated to the flight, the captain doesn't cross-verify this change. No check, no confirmation, nothing. You might think, come on, Captain Jack, that's a major deviation from standard operating procedure. And yes, my friend, it absolutely is. But hold on, we're just getting started. It's 2:15 p.m., and the first officer calls up ATC to request permission to descend. ATC responds, Pakistan 8303, descend flight level 100, pilot discretion, proceed direct Makli. Focus on those words, proceed direct Makli. Because there aren't many flights in the air today, the ATC decides to give them a shortcut. Although they were originally cleared for the Nawabshah 2A route, ATC now permits them to skip the turn at Hyderabad and fly directly to Makli. This new route is called Nawabshah 1C. They've also been cleared to descend to flight level 100, that's 10,000 feet. So the first officer changes the altitude assignment in the autopilot, but once again, and I mean come on, there's no cross-check of this change done by the captain. The pilot set up the autopilot to follow a managed descent. In this mode, the autopilot calculates a descent path, taking into consideration the total number of track miles left to fly, the speed the pilot wants to maintain, and any altitude restrictions at waypoints along the route. Usually, if everything is set up correctly, the plane should start a descent at around 2,000 feet per minute. This plane, though, it's only descending at 1,000 feet per minute, half the normal rate. A slower descent usually happens when the computer thinks there's a long way to go to the airport, but they're less than 150 nautical miles from Karachi. The plane should have started a proper descent already. So why does the autopilot think there's more distance to fly? Remember that holding pattern at Sabin, the one designed to help them descend from 8,000 feet to 3,000 feet? Well, with ATC now providing a direct route, both the controller and the pilots intend to arrive at Makli at 3,000 feet without needing to do the holding pattern. The first officer clicks the direct button on the flight management computer and instructs the system to fly straight to Makli. But here's the problem. He hasn't told the computer that the holding pattern should not be flown. The computer still thinks they're going to fly that holding pattern at Sabin, so the plane thinks there's around 30 nautical miles more to fly than what the pilots expect. Think about it. The autopilot is planning for a flight path that no longer exists. Understand? This miscommunication between man and machine is about to make everything worse. You will see. So after a while, the plane reaches the point where it calculates it needs to start descending.
The engines are brought back to idle, and the plane begins to descend at 2,400 feet per minute. Better, but still based on faulty assumptions. Karachi ATC clears them down further to 5,000 feet. Once again, the first officer silently changes the altitude target to 5,000 feet in the autopilot. There's no cross-verification, no verbal confirmation. The captain just sits there, not monitoring, not checking.
Usually, at this point in the flight, the plane is handed off from Karachi Area Control to Karachi Approach Control. And here comes another mistake. Out of habit, and without clearance from ATC, one of the pilots changes the frequency on the radio. Not only did they change it without approval, they also entered the wrong frequency. Instead of 125.5, they entered 126.5. This means ATC can't contact the plane at all. For 5 minutes, the controllers are trying to reach Flight 8303 with no response. Finally, ATC is able to contact them by calling on the guard frequency, the emergency frequency that all aircraft monitor. So Karachi Approach clears them to descend further to 3,000 feet. Here's where the situation gets critical. Since the plane started descending late, it's extremely high compared to where it should be for a straight-in approach. But the crew still isn't aware. All they needed to do was pay attention to the screens in front of them. They would have seen the U-turn indicator at Sabin. They would have seen the word hold in the flight management computer. But since they're not following procedure, since they're not cross-checking, not briefing, not monitoring, they completely miss it. Now, they are 5 minutes away from the Mackley waypoint, more than 3 times too high to land safely. A minute later, with the runway in view through the windscreen, the first officer arms the approach mode to make the plane capture the glide slope, the invisible beam that guides aircraft down to the runway at a safe 3-degree angle. But in this mode, once the glide slope is captured, the computer will ignore all program navigation, including the holding pattern at Sabin. And without that hold, the plane will continue to be way too high when it reaches the airport. Karachi ATC, who's monitoring the plane's path on radar, notices that they're more than twice the height they're supposed to be. The controller gets concerned. He calls out to the plane, "Pakistan 8303, confirm track mile comfortable for descent?" I think it's a polite way of saying, "Are you sure you're okay? Because from where I'm sitting, you look way too high." The crew responds, "Affirm." This call must have awakened the captain. He must have wondered why such a question was being asked. So he checks the screens in front of him. Only then does he realize their mistake. They haven't removed the holding pattern at Sabin from the flight computer. He becomes alarmed. "What has happened? Stop, stop, oh no, take out the hold, take out the hold, take out the hold."
But here's the tragedy. The hold was the only thing that was going to get the plane down to the runway in time. It was their last chance to descend safely. Unfortunately, the first officer responds immediately and cancels the hold. He then asks the captain, "Hold taken out. Should we report this issue?" The captain says no. He overrules the first officer and instructs him to tell ATC that everything is fine. Remember that steep power gradient we discussed some minutes ago? Well, that's now influencing the first officer's decisions. So he switches the plane from managed descent mode to open descent mode. In open descent, the plane will stop following the computed path and merely start descending at a predetermined speed until it hits the target altitude in the flight management unit, which in this case is 3,000 feet. To descend faster, the first officer deploys the speed brakes, panels that pop up from the wings to increase drag and slow the aircraft down. Now, the plane is at 9,210 feet, just 15 nautical miles from the runway threshold. To capture the 3-degree glide slope properly, they should have been at 4,700 feet. They are almost twice as high as where they should be. The Karachi Tower controller has also noticed that the plane is too high. The plane flies over the Sabin waypoint. The controller continues, "You are at 7,500 feet, 10 miles from touchdown." He's trying to prompt them to realize that the approach isn't stable, that they need to go around and try again, right? But the crew responds, "No problem, sir."
A minute later, at 7,400 feet, the landing gear is brought down and flaps are set to flaps 1 position. The vertical speed increases from 2,300 feet per minute to an astonishing 7,500 feet per minute. 7,500 feet per minute, this is a ridiculously extreme angle to be approaching the runway from. The plane is diving toward the ground like a fighter jet, not a passenger airliner. The approach controller, who is still worried, reminds them, "Sir, orbit is available if you want." He's saying they could make a 360-degree turn to lose altitude and get back on the normal flight path. It's a lifeline. Take it. The captain sees no issue with their approach and tells the first officer to say no. The first officer responds to ATC, "Negative, sir. We are comfortable. We can make it." They're putting their faith in divine intervention instead of following basic procedures.
The plane continues to barrel toward the ground. It crosses 400-500 feet, just 7 miles away from the runway. Since the target altitude set in the autopilot is 3,000 feet, the plane begins to reduce its descent to level off at 3,000 feet. At almost the same time, the captain says he will be surprised what we have done. What? He's proud of what they've done to bring the plane to 3,000 feet without doing an orbit? Really? But the approach controller at this point has had enough. He gives them an order, not a suggestion, an order. Pakistan 8303, disregard, turn left heading 180. He's telling them to turn away from the runway, to abort the approach. The crew responds, "Sir, we are comfortable now and we are out of 3,500 for 3,000, established on the ILS-25L. He says he's established on the ILS, the instrument landing system. The glide slope requires a 3-degree slope to lock onto, but they're almost twice as high as where the 3-degree slope is. So how is he claiming they're established on the ILS? Is he lying?" The plane begins descending down toward the runway at an extreme angle and speed begins to increase. The approach controller gives them another direct order. Negative, turn left heading 180. Any other pilot would have turned left immediately, but this captain just responds, "Sir, we are established on ILS-25L. He completely disregards the instruction. The plane is continuing at an extremely high angle. Because of the steep angle and the high speed, several warnings start blaring in the cockpit. It echoes with "overspeed" and "don't sink" warnings. The cockpit is a symphony of alarms. 30 seconds later, the plane's pitch increases further to negative 13.7 degrees. At this point, the autopilot disengages because it's not programmed to fly at such steep angles. The autopilot disconnect sound is heard, and the first officer takes manual control. But again, no communication between the two pilots occurs. None. They're not talking to each other in a critical moment when communication is everything. Suddenly, a GPWS pull-up warning comes on. When this warning activates, pilots are trained to immediately execute a terrain escape maneuver. Full power, pitch up, get away from the ground. No questions asked. Suddenly, the first officer pulls back on the side stick, reducing the descent rate from negative 7,400 feet per minute to negative 2,000 feet per minute. In an attempt to stabilize the approach and possibly do the orbit that was offered, the first officer retracts the landing gear and the speed brakes. But no verbal communication is done between the pilots. The captain isn't aware that the wheels are up. The first officer asks the captain whether they should do a 360-degree turn. The captain overrules him, yelling, "No, no, leave it." The captain then immediately takes over control by pressing the side stick priority button and continues to fly the plane down toward the runway. He's committed to landing, no matter what. Just at the same time, ATC clears the plane to land on runway 25L. The captain, who's mentally prepared to land, moves the flaps to the flaps 2 position to increase the drag and slow the plane down further. Now the plane enters what's called the 1,000 feet stabilization gate. It's the point at which the plane should be absolutely stabilized in order to carry out a landing. Airspeed, vertical speed, pitch, and glide slope must all be within limits. But in this plane, the airspeed is too high. The vertical speed is too high. The pitch is wrong. The glide slope is wrong. The plane is absolutely unstabilized and should execute a go-around immediately. Take a wild guess what they did. Yes, they continued. Now they're at 750 feet in altitude, just 1.5 miles from the runway threshold.
The plane tries to warn the crew that the landing gear is not down. A red ECAB message appears on the screen, landing gear not down. There's also a red arrow near the landing gear lever flashing insistently. As the plane keeps descending, more warnings are triggered. Too low terrain, sink rate, pull up. The landing gear is still up. The plane crosses the threshold at 200 knots way too fast. Because of the excessive speed, it completely overshoots the touchdown zone, floating down the runway. When the plane descends to just 7 feet off the ground, the captain selects full reverse thrust, trying to slow the plane down, but reverse thrust only deploys once the wheels touch the ground. Since the landing gear hasn't been extended, the reverse thrust never engages.
As the plane floats over the runway, both engine nacelles, the metal casings around the engines, impact the ground. The entire plane starts vibrating violently. The engines begin to scrape along the runway, metal grinding against concrete. The friction causes sparks and fire to erupt. The sparks are so bright, they're visible from the terminal building. The captain tries to slow the plane down by applying maximum brake inputs, but since the wheels aren't on the ground, the brakes don't do anything. The plane continues to bounce on the runway up to 4 times, scraping and creating massive showers of sparks every time it hits. The captain continues to push the side stick down, trying to keep the plane on the ground. The first officer, clearly realizing the major trouble they're in, hesitantly pulls his stick back 2/3 of the way. When 2 different inputs are provided on an Airbus, the plane takes the average of the 2 inputs. So the plane continues to scrape further into the ground. This causes the plane to lean toward the right, making the number 2 engine, the right engine, touch the ground for a prolonged period. It scrapes along the runway, sustaining catastrophic damage. A fire erupts on engine 2. The fire warning light lights up in the cockpit. Engine 2 fails. All electrical systems are switched over from engine 1 to engine 2. The first officer shouts, "Take off, sir! Take off, sir!" 2 seconds later, the captain advances the thrust levers to toga mode, takeoff, go-around power. Since the plane is already at 160 knots, it gets airborne again almost immediately. Engine 1 has to do all the heavy lifting to get the plane back in the air. The first officer informs ATC that they're going around, but the controller has seen the belly landing. A full-fledged emergency has already been initiated at the airport. As the crew retracts the flaps, engine 2 goes into auto start mode and begins to recover. But because of the prolonged scraping of the engines on the runway, a major hole has formed in the engine casing. Engine oil is leaking out of it, streaming into the sky behind them. As the plane crosses 1,200 feet, low oil pressure warnings for both engines are triggered. The master caution warning also lights up, putting immense pressure on the 2 pilots. In order to focus, the crew cancels the warnings and continues climbing to 3,000 feet.
ATC instructs them to turn left to heading 110 degrees and to level off at 3,000 feet. At about the same time, due to the severe impact it has undergone, Engine 1 fails. Remember, Engine 1 was the only engine powering all of the electrical equipment on the plane. All they have left now is the APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, and the ram air turbine for electrical power. But thankfully, Engine 2, which was attempting to auto-restart, successfully begins to turn on. But sadly, and this is tragic, the first officer notices the earlier fire warning for Engine 2 and moves the thrust lever for Engine 2 to idle, trying to protect the engine from further damage. The engine that had just turned on is now back in idle. They've just shut down their only working engine. The plane continues to fly downwind, losing altitude and losing speed. It's now at 1,900 feet. The captain, clearly disoriented, asks the first officer where the runway is. The first officer points to the runway out of the captain's left window. ATC, seeing the plane losing altitude, calls out, "Pakistan 8303, you are dropping, altitude 2,000. The crew requests clearance to remain at 2,000, which is cleared, but the plane keeps descending further. ATC warns them again. The first officer responds, "Copied, we are trying to maintain." The first officer reminds the captain to maintain a minimum speed of 140 knots because the ram air turbine will stop working at any speed under that. If they lose the ram turbine, they will lose all electrical systems. Everything will go dark. The captain, who at this point notices that the Engine 2 thrust lever is in idle, says to the first officer, "You have selected Engine 2 to idle. Engine 1 is gone." The first officer responds with, "Yeah." Almost at the same time, Engine 2 also shuts down completely due to the previous damage. They are now flying with no engines, just the ram turbine keeping the electrical systems alive. The first officer pleads with the captain, "Increase the speed." The captain, obviously flustered, responds, "How will I increase my speed?" ATC says, "Looks like you are turning left." The first officer responds, "We are proceeding direct, sir. We have lost both engines." The controller then asks the crew to confirm whether they'll be attempting a belly landing again. The first officer responds, "Negative, sir." The captain instructs the first officer to bring the landing gear down. The first officer complies and brings the lever down.
Well, this is the last nail in their coffin. With no engines on the plane, the aircraft is just a glider. They're already very close to the ground with a slim chance of making it back to the runway, but by extending the landing gear, they substantially increase the drag on the plane and reduce the distance it can glide. The first officer calls out, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." The plane descends to 700 feet. Soon after, the stall warning blares in the cockpit. The plane turns left toward the runway. The Karachi controller informs them that all runways are available. The situation in the cockpit is tense and confusing, with all sorts of warnings going off simultaneously. As the plane descends through 400 feet, the captain calls out, "Don't take flaps, don't take flaps," obviously trying to avoid any extra drag on the airplane. But with the gear hanging out, they've already sealed their fate. And then it happened. At 2:18 p.m. local time, the plane crashes into a densely populated residential area called Model Colony, about 1,300 meters short of runway 25 left. The plane immediately breaks apart. An intense fire erupts, engulfing several buildings around the crash site. Only 2 people survived this crash, but not the captain or the first officer. One person on the ground is also fatally injured. The questions here: why did it happen? Who are the responsibles for 97 lost souls? Only the pilots? And most important, what authorities did to prevent a horrible tragedy like this from happening again? This is what I'm going to show you right now. So, what actually caused this disaster? Let me tell you, the final report found the primary cause to be non-adherence to rules and regulations by the crew. But let's dig deeper, because there's more to this story. Because from a pilot perspective, this accident was entirely preventable. Let's break down what should have happened versus what went wrong.
First, the approach briefing. This is not optional, it's mandatory. The crew should have discussed the approach route, altitudes, speeds, and contingency plans. They skipped it completely. When the ATC gave them the shortcut to fly direct to Mockley, they should have immediately briefed the change and removed the holding pattern from the flight computer. They didn't. This created the entire chain of events that followed. Second, cross-checking. Every time a pilot makes a change to the autopilot or flight management system, the other pilot must verify it. It's called Crew Resource Management, CRM, and it exists specifically to catch mistakes before they become disasters. These 2 pilots, they ignored this fundamental procedure throughout the entire flight. Think about it. If the captain had cross-checked even once, he would have caught the holding pattern error early enough to fix it. Third, the unstabilized approach. There are clear rules in aviation. If your approach isn't stabilized by 1,000 feet, you go around. No exceptions. This approach was unstabilized from the moment they crossed Mockley at 9,300 feet instead of 3,000. They should have executed a go-around immediately. Instead, they continued with a 6-degree descent angle, twice as steep as normal. The warnings were screaming at them. Overspeed, don't sink, too low terrain, pull up. They ignored every single one. Fourth, and this is critical, the landing gear. The first officer retracted the gear during the approach, probably trying to reduce drag and salvage the landing. But he never communicated this to the captain. When they attempted to land, the captain had no idea the wheels were up. This is a catastrophic failure of communication, my friend. In the cockpit, you must verbalize every action, always. Now, here's what the investigation also found. It was Ramadan. The captain and first officer had been fasting for 8 hours. So the pilot's fasting during Ramadan may have been a secondary contributor. Reduced blood sugar levels can affect spatial awareness and decision-making. Were they impaired? We can't say for certain. What do you think?
But let me be clear about something. This wasn't just about 2 pilots making mistakes. The investigation revealed systemic failures within Pakistan International Airlines and Pakistani aviation as a whole. Captain Gul had a documented history of unstabilized approaches, excessive descent rates, and ignoring GPWS warnings. Yet he was never retrained or grounded. The airline allowed this behavior to continue for years.
That's a massive failure of oversight. And here's the bombshell that came out during the investigation. 40% of all pilots flying in Pakistan were operating with fake licenses. 40%! These weren't qualified pilots, they had fraudulent credentials. This revelation was so damaging that Pakistan International Airlines was immediately blacklisted by both the European Union and the United States. Pakistani carriers were banned from flying to these regions. So, yes, the crew is responsible for their actions, but the system that allowed them to fly, that failed to enforce standards, that tolerated corner cutting, that permitted fake licenses, that system is equally guilty, my friend. You know what I'm talking about, right? This disaster was waiting to happen. That's my point. Now, here is my favorite part in every episode. What did the aviation industry learn from Flight 8303? Well, this accident forced massive changes, especially in Pakistan. First, and most important, Pakistan International Airlines immediately banned pilots from flying while fasting. International regulations already prohibited this, but domestic flights were exempt. Not anymore. The science is clear. Reduced blood sugar affects decision-making and spatial awareness. Second, the fake license scandal. When investigators discovered that 40% of Pakistani pilots had fraudulent licenses, it sent shockwaves through the entire aviation community. Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority launched a massive investigation. Hundreds of pilots were grounded and had their licenses revoked. New verification procedures were implemented. Background checks became more rigorous. The message was clear: no more shortcuts, no more corruption.
Third, crew resource management training was overhauled. The power gradient between Captain Gull and First Officer Azam played a significant role in this accident. Junior officers must feel empowered to challenge senior captains when they see something wrong. Airlines worldwide reinforced CRM training, emphasizing that the first officer has not just the right, but the duty to speak up during unsafe operations. Fourth, unstabilized approach procedures were reinforced across the industry. If you're not stable by 1,000 feet, you go around. Period. No exceptions. No "we can make it" attitudes. Airlines implemented stricter monitoring of approach profiles and started tracking pilots who consistently flew unstabilized approaches. Flight 8303 didn't have to happen, but because it did, the industry became safer. That's the tragic irony of aviation, you know? We learn from disasters, we write new rules, and we make sure it never happens again. Good, you're still here, so please, make my day and like this video. Because, yes, I'm going to tell you again, it took days plus days of work to bring you a new episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, right? I'm your captain, Jack Mercer. Thanks for flying with me, and I see you on the next.